Rain hammered against the crystal windows of Blackthorne Palace, while Queen Selene Draven stood alone in the highest tower, staring down at an empire built on lies. Below her, the capital glittered like a kingdom blessed by gods, but crowns were excellent at hiding rot. She had spent 7 years beside Alpha King Lucien, learning the brutal truth. The higher a man climbed, the more terrified he became of losing what he owned. Then Kael Varyn returned from war, the king's most feared general, his closest friend, and looked at her the way starving men looked at fire during winter. Not as property, as a woman drowning inside a gilded prison. And that's when betrayal became inevitable. Stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button, and drop your city name in the comments so I know where my pack is watching from. The first time Selene Draven understood she had married a monster wearing a crown, she was standing in the grand hall watching her husband smile. It was not the smile itself that terrified her. It was how perfectly he performed it. Lucien Draven, Alpha King of the Blackthorne Empire, stood beneath chandeliers heavy with gold and candlelight, his hand pressed against the shoulder of Lord Matthias Gorin, a minor noble whose shipping routes fed the capital. The lord was weeping, openly, gratefully, because the king had just forgiven a debt that would have bankrupted 3 generations of his family. Mercy, the court whispered, generosity, proof that their king possessed a heart beneath all that power. But Selene saw something else. She saw the way Lucien's eyes remained cold even while his mouth curved upward. She saw how his fingers tightened just slightly against the lord's shoulder, not enough to hurt, but enough to remind the man exactly who held his life between their hands. She saw the calculation behind every word, every gesture, every perfectly timed pause designed to make the entire room fall more desperately in love with their ruler. Lord Gorin stumbled away weeping with relief, and the moment his back turned, Lucien's smile died like someone had blown out a candle. His eyes found Selene across the hall, empty, flat, assessing her the way generals assessed battlefields before deciding where to plant their flags. That night, alone in their chambers, she asked him why he had forgiven the debt. Lucien was standing near the fireplace, still wearing his formal black military coat decorated with silver threading and the royal crest. He poured himself whiskey from a crystal decanter and answered without looking at her. "Because fear only works when people believe you might show mercy," he said quietly. "You rule through unpredictability. Kindness one day, brutality the next. That way they never stop trying to earn your favor." Selene felt something twist inside her chest. "You forgave him to make everyone else more afraid." Lucien finally looked at her. "I forgave him because it cost me nothing and bought me everything." He drank. She realized in that moment she was married to a man who experienced the world entirely through strategy. Every relationship was leverage. Every emotion was performance. Even their marriage was theater designed to project strength across rival kingdoms who respected dynastic stability. Love had never entered the equation, not once. Selene had known this before the wedding, of course. Royal marriages were not built on affection. They were built on alliances, bloodlines, territorial advantages, and the appearance of unity strong enough to keep enemies from smelling weakness. Her family, House Vaelin, controlled the eastern provinces and their vast grain production. Lucien needed their resources to feed his expanding military. Her father needed the king's protection from northern warlords circling their borders like wolves around wounded prey. The marriage was a transaction. She was the currency. Selene had accepted this reality the way women throughout history had accepted the weight of crowns they never asked to wear. She told herself she could survive without love. She told herself duty was enough. She told herself that loneliness was simply the price powerful women paid for stability. For 7 years she believed it, until Kael Varyn walked back through the palace gates carrying the smell of war and gunpowder and something she had almost forgotten existed: honesty. The royal court had been preparing for General Varyn's return for weeks. Banners hung from every tower. Servants polished marble floors until they reflected firelight like mirrors. Cooks prepared feasts large enough to feed entire battalions. The capital buzzed with anticipation because Kael Varyn was not just another military commander. He was legend wrapped in black leather and battlefield scars. The undefeated wolf, the shadow of the empire, The man who had conquered 12 territories in 5 years without losing a single campaign. Selene had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. But stories were distant things, and she had learned long ago not to trust the myths powerful men built around themselves. Then he arrived. It was late afternoon when the main gates opened and Kael rode into the palace courtyard on a black warhorse that looked half wild and barely controlled. He was wearing dark military leather still stained with ash and dirt. His black hair longer than regulation allowed, tied back loosely at the base of his neck. Scars crossed his throat like faded lightning. His face was all sharp edges and exhaustion. He looked nothing like the polished generals who filled Lucien's court. He looked dangerous, real, alive in a way that made everyone else seem like carefully painted portraits pretending to breathe. Lucien descended the palace steps with his usual calculated grace, his arms spread wide in the performance of brotherhood. The two men embraced while the entire court watched, and Selene found herself studying the way Kael's jaw tightened slightly during the gesture. So brief most people missed it entirely. But she saw it. The discomfort, the restraint, the sense that he was enduring affection rather than returning it. When they pulled apart, Lucien kept one hand on Kael's shoulder and turned to address the gathered nobles with the kind of speech designed to be repeated in every tavern and trading post across the empire. "Behold the wolf who guards our borders," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the courtyard. "My brother in all but blood. The sword that carves our future from the bones of our enemies." The court erupted in applause. Kael said nothing. His silver eyes swept across the crowd with the blank efficiency of someone cataloging threats. And for just a moment, so fast Selene almost convinced herself she imagined it, his gaze locked onto hers. She felt her breath catch. Not from attraction, from recognition. Because the exhaustion in his eyes looked exactly like the exhaustion she saw every morning in her own reflection. The look of someone drowning slowly inside a life they never chose. The welcome banquet that night was exactly the kind of suffocating performance Selene had learned to hate. 300 nobles crammed into the grand hall beneath chandeliers burning with 1,000 candles, long tables covered in silk and gold, roasted meats, spiced wine, fruit imported from territories so distant their names sounded like fairy tales, musicians playing softly in the corners while politicians maneuvered through conversations like soldiers navigating minefields. Selene sat beside Lucien at the head table, wearing a gown the color of midnight and a crown that felt heavier every year. She smiled when required, laughed at jokes that were not funny, played her role with the same mechanical precision she had perfected over 7 years of marriage. Kael sat 3 seats away, still wearing his battlefield leathers, because he had refused the formal court attire servants tried forcing on him earlier. That alone sent whispers rippling through the hall. Disrespectful, some murmured. Arrogant. But Selene understood it differently. He was refusing to perform. Throughout the dinner, nobles approached Kael constantly, trying to pull him into their endless games of alliance and favor trading. He answered every question with brutal brevity, his responses so blunt they bordered on insult. "How did you defeat the northern clans, General Varyn?" "I killed their leaders." "What strategy did you employ at the Carveth crossing?" "I crossed it." "Do you have advice for young commanders hoping to follow your path?" "Do not follow anyone's path." By the 3rd hour, most nobles had stopped trying. Lucien watched all of this with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, occasionally leaning close to Selene to make quiet observations. "He has gotten worse," the king murmured, swirling wine in his crystal goblet. "War hardens men, but Kael has let it consume him entirely." Selene kept her voice neutral. "Perhaps he is simply tired of pretending." Lucien's smile sharpened. "We are all pretending, my queen. That is what power demands." Later, when the musicians shifted to something slower and several couples began dancing, Lucien stood and extended his hand towards Selene with the kind of theatrical gallantry designed to make everyone in the room sigh at their perfect marriage. She took his hand because refusing was not an option. They moved through the dance with practiced precision, every step rehearsed through years of public performance. Lucien held her exactly close enough to project intimacy without actual warmth. He smiled down at her the way husbands were supposed to smile at their wives. And Selene felt absolutely nothing. "You are distracted tonight," Lucien observed quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I am tired." His hand tightened slightly against her waist. "Try harder." She did. She always did. When the dance ended, Lucien was immediately pulled into conversation with foreign diplomats, and Selene found herself alone near the edge of the hall, standing beside tall windows overlooking the capital below. Rain had started falling again, turning the city into a blur of golden lights and dark streets. She was so focused on the view that she did not hear anyone approach until a voice spoke quietly beside her. "You hate this." Selene turned sharply. Kael Varyn stood a few feet away, holding a glass of whiskey and looking at her with an expression that was not quite a question. She felt her spine straighten defensively. "Hate what, General?" "All of it." He gestured vaguely toward the hall behind them, where nobles continued their endless performance of false friendship and political maneuvering. The dancing, the smiling, the pretending you enjoy being watched like a museum exhibit. Selene's first instinct was to deflect with the kind of diplomatic non-answer she had perfected over the years. But something about the exhaustion in his eyes made lying feel pointless. "Is it that obvious?" she asked quietly. Kael took a drink. "Only to someone who feels the same way." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rain continued hammering against the windows. Behind them, music played. Nobles laughed. And Selene realized she was standing beside the first person in 7 years who had looked at her and seen something other than the crown on her head. "You should return to the celebration," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "They will wonder where their hero disappeared to." Kael smiled faintly, though it held no warmth. "I am not their hero. I am their weapon. There is a difference." He finished his whiskey and set the empty glass on a nearby table. Before he walked away, he paused and looked at her one more time. "For what it is worth, Your Majesty, you deserve better than this." Then he was gone, disappearing back into the crowd, leaving Selene standing alone beside the windows with her heart beating faster than it should have been. Because powerful women do not fall for compliments. They fall for being seen. The affair did not begin that night. It began slowly, carefully. The way dangerous things always begin, with small moments that seem insignificant until they accumulate into something impossible to ignore. Over the following weeks, Kael became a permanent fixture in the royal court. Lucien kept him close, relying on his military expertise during strategy meetings, and using his reputation to intimidate visiting dignitaries who might otherwise test the empire's strength. Selene saw him constantly, in council chambers during endless political debates, in the training yard sparring with royal guards, in hallways late at night when the palace finally fell quiet. They never planned to be in the same places. But somehow, they always were. Their conversations started innocently enough, brief exchanges about nothing important. "How is the capital treating you, General?" "Like a trophy they do not know what to do with." "You miss the battlefield." "I miss purpose." "War is brutal, but at least it is honest." Little by little, those conversations grew longer, more personal, more dangerous. Selene learned that Kael hated court politics with barely concealed disgust. He had spent years conquering territories for Lucien, only to watch corrupt nobles grow rich from soldiers' deaths, while veterans begged for food in the capital streets. He believed power should protect the weak, not feed on them, a dangerous philosophy inside royal circles. Kael learned that Selene had wanted to be a scholar before her marriage. She had studied history, philosophy, literature, subjects her father dismissed as useless for a future queen. She had dreamed of universities and debates and libraries filled with books instead of soldiers. But duty had crushed those dreams the moment she accepted Lucien's proposal. Now she spent her days attending meaningless ceremonies and smiling for crowds who only cared about her bloodline. One evening, after a particularly brutal council meeting where Lucien had publicly humiliated a minor lord for questioning tax policy, Selene found Kael standing on a balcony overlooking the training yards below. She should have walked past. Instead, she stopped. "That was cruel," she said quietly. Kael glanced at her. "Your husband?" Selene nodded. Kael turned back toward the view. "Cruelty is how he maintains control. Fear is efficient." She stepped closer to the railing. "You disagree?" It was not a question. Kael was silent for a moment. "Fear works," he said finally, "but loyalty lasts longer." Selene looked at him. Is that why soldiers follow you? They follow me because I do not ask them to die for strategies I would not execute myself. I eat the same rations, sleep in the same mud, bury the same bodies. He paused. Lucien rules from a throne. I fight from the front lines. That is the difference. Selene felt something shift inside her chest. You think he is a coward? Kael's jaw tightened. I think he is a king, and kings sacrifice pieces they do not value. He looked at her directly. Including queens. The air between them changed, became heavier, more dangerous. Selene knew she should leave, walk away, go back to her chambers and forget this conversation ever happened. But instead, she stayed. And that was the moment the affair truly began. Not with a touch, not with a kiss, but with the terrible realization that someone finally understood exactly how trapped she was. The first time they touched, it happened by accident. A royal banquet celebrating Lucien's latest territorial acquisition. Foreign dignitaries, endless courses, political theater disguised as celebration. Selene was exhausted. She had spent the entire evening smiling beside Lucien while he entertained visiting warlords, her role reduced to decorative proof of dynastic stability. By midnight, her face hurt from maintaining the perfect expression expected of queens. Lucien eventually disappeared with a group of diplomats and several noblewomen whose laughter sounded too loud and too practiced, leaving Selene alone at the head table surrounded by empty chairs and half-finished wine glasses. She stood and walked toward the nearest balcony, desperate for air that did not smell like perfume and politics. Kael was already there, standing in shadow, watching the capital below. Selene almost turned around, but he spoke before she could retreat. You can stay. I was just leaving. She shook her head. I need the silence more than you do. Kael smiled faintly. Then we will be silent together. They stood side by side for a long time without speaking, rain falling softly beyond the covered balcony. Below them, the capital glittered like something beautiful instead of something built on conquest and suffering. Finally, Selene spoke. Do you ever regret it? Regret what? Fighting for him. Kael's expression darkened. Every day. Why do you stay? He took a long breath. Because leaving would mean abandoning the soldiers who still believe this empire is worth dying for. Selene looked at him. But you do not believe that anymore. Kael met her eyes. No. The honesty in his voice hit her like a physical blow. Because she had spent 7 years surrounded by people who measured every word, calculated every gesture, performed every emotion. And here was someone finally telling her the truth without filtering it through political strategy. She reached out without thinking. Her hand brushed against his. Just fingers. Just contact. But for Selene, it felt catastrophic. Kael went completely still, his eyes locked onto hers. And in that moment, they both understood exactly what was happening between them. This was not lust. This was recognition. Two people trapped inside roles they never chose, finally finding someone who understood the suffocation. Kael pulled his hand back slowly, his voice rough. You should go. Selene knew he was right, but she did not move. Your Majesty, Kael said again, more forcefully. Please. There was something desperate in his voice, like a man trying to stop himself from drowning. Selene finally stepped back. Her heart was beating too fast. I am sorry, she whispered. Kael shook his head. You have nothing to apologize for. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Selene. She froze. He had never used her name before. Always Your Majesty. Your Grace. My Queen. Never just her name. When she looked back, his expression was raw, unguarded, terrifying. He is going to destroy you, Kael said quietly. Slowly. The same way he destroys everything he owns. Selene felt tears burning behind her eyes. I know. Then why do you stay? Because I do not have a choice. Everyone has a choice. Selene laughed bitterly. Not queens. She walked away before he could respond, her hands shaking, her chest tight, everything inside her screaming that she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. Because the most dangerous affairs are never born from lust. They are born from emotional starvation. And empires collapse fastest when powerful people begin seeking comfort in the wrong arms. Thoughts. After that night, Distance became impossible. They tried. Kael avoided her during council meetings. Selene stopped walking through the palace corridors late at night. But the palace was not built for avoidance. It was built for surveillance. Every hallway led back to the same rooms. Every ceremony forced them into the same space. And Lucien noticed everything. One evening, during a private dinner in the royal chambers, the king leaned back in his chair and studied Selene with the kind of careful attention that always preceded interrogation. "You have been distant lately," he observed. Selene kept her voice neutral. "I have been tired." Lucien smiled. "You are always tired, but tired women do not smile the way you smiled at General Varyn during yesterday's military briefing." Selene's blood went cold. "I was being polite. You were being reckless." He stood and walked toward her slowly, his movements predatory. "I do not share, Selene." "I thought you understood that." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "You are imagining things." Lucien laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Am I?" He reached out and traced one finger along her jaw with terrifying gentleness. "I have spent years learning to read people, my queen. Fear, desire, deception. I can see all of it. And right now I see a woman who has started looking at someone else the way she should only look at her king." Selene's heart was pounding, but she kept her expression perfectly calm. "You are paranoid. And you are lying." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "But I will give you one warning. Whatever you think you feel for him, end it. Because if I discover you have betrayed me, I will not kill you." He pulled back, his smile cold. "I will kill him, slowly, and make you watch." Then he walked away, leaving Selene standing alone in the center of their chambers, shaking with terror and rage, and the terrible understanding that Lucien had just declared war without ever raising his voice. "Mam Mausam." She should have ended it then, walked away from Kael completely, protected them both by choosing duty over emotion. But the human heart is not logical, and loneliness is a stronger force than fear. 3 nights later, Selene found herself standing outside the military tower, where Kael had been given quarters during his stay in the capital. Rain was falling. The palace was silent. She knocked once. Kael opened the door immediately, still wearing the black training leathers he used during sparring sessions. His hair was loose. His expression shifted from surprise to something darker the moment he saw her. "What are you doing here?" he asked quietly. Selene stepped inside without answering and closed the door behind her. The room was sparse. A single bed, a desk covered in military maps, weapons mounted on the wall. Nothing decorative, nothing personal. Just the quarters of the man who never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home. Kael stood in the center of the room, watching her with an expression somewhere between desire and devastation. "You need to leave," he said roughly. Selene shook her head. "I am tired of leaving." "Selene, I am tired of pretending. I am tired of smiling. I'm tired of being treated like property instead of a person." Her voice cracked. "I am tired of feeling nothing." Kael closed his eyes. "If anyone discovers you here, I do not care." "You should." She stepped closer to him. "Why did you come back to the capital, Kael?" For a long moment, he did not answer. Then quietly, "Because Lucien ordered me to. That is not what I asked." Kael opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression so raw it hurt. "Because I could not stay away." The admission hung between them like smoke. Selene reached up and touched his face, her fingers brushing against the scars crossing his jaw. "This will destroy us both," she whispered. Kael's hand covered hers. "I know." Then he kissed her, violently, desperately, like someone dying of thirst finally finding water. Selene kissed him back with 7 years of suffocated emotion pouring out all at once. There was nothing gentle about it, nothing romantic, just raw need and desperation and the terrible relief of finally feeling something real. When they finally broke apart, both of them were shaking. Kael pressed his forehead against hers, his breath ragged. "This is treason," he said hoarsely. Selene laughed bitterly. "Everything about my life is treason." She pulled him toward the bed. And for the first time in 7 years, Queen Selene Draven felt alive. The affair that followed was reckless, dangerous, inevitable. They met in secret chambers, abandoned libraries, hunting lodges deep in snow-covered forests beyond the capital walls. Every stolen moment carried the weight of execution. Every touch was addiction wrapped in terror. Selene learned the man beneath the legendary warrior slowly. Kael was brilliant, scarred, haunted by every soldier he had buried with his own hands. He hated the empire he had built for Lucien, hated himself for becoming the weapon that carved territories from blood and bone. He had wanted to be a builder once, an architect, someone who created instead of destroyed, but war had other plans. Now he was trapped inside a reputation he could never escape. The undefeated wolf, the shadow of the empire, a legend that left no room for the man underneath. Selene understood that trap better than anyone. They talked for hours in those stolen moments, sharing the parts of themselves they had buried beneath duty and performance. Kael told her about the nightmares, the guilt, the way victory felt more like drowning every year. Selene told him about the loneliness, the suffocation, the way her own reflection had become a stranger wearing a crown. And slowly, impossibly, they fell in love. Not the clean, simple kind written about in stories. The messy, complicated, destructive kind that happens when two broken people find each other inside the ruins of lives they never wanted. But love inside a royal court is never private, and secrets inside palaces do not stay buried. One morning, Selene returned to her chambers after spending the night in the northern hunting lodge with Kael. Snow still clung to the hem of her cloak. Her hair smelled like wood smoke and winter air. Lucien was waiting beside the fireplace, silent, watching her. The entire room felt like a trap. "Where were you?" he asked calmly. And Selene understood with terrible clarity that everything was about to shatter. Because kings survive through instinct, and Lucien had smelled betrayal long before it fully formed. Lucien stood beside the fireplace, wearing the expression of a man who had already won the argument before it started. Selene forced herself to walk deeper into the room instead of freezing near the door, like prey that had just sensed the trap closing. Her cloak dripped melted snow onto marble floors. Her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough she wondered if he could hear it from across the chamber. "The hunting estate," she said, keeping her voice level. "I needed air." Lucien tilted his head slightly. "Air? Yes. For 12 hours. She met his eyes. I lost track of time. The king laughed softly, but the sound held no warmth. He set his whiskey glass down on the mantel with deliberate care, the crystal making a sharp sound against stone that felt too loud in the silent room. "You smell like smoke," he observed quietly. "Wood smoke. The kind that comes from burning pine logs in old stone fireplaces." Selene said nothing. "The Northern Hunting Lodge has a pine fireplace," Lucien continued, his tone conversational. "I know this because I designed that estate myself years ago, before we were married, back when I still believed isolation might cure whatever emptiness lived inside me." He walked toward her slowly. It did not work then either. Selene's hands were shaking beneath her cloak. She clenched them into fists. "I went riding," she said. "The storm came in faster than expected. I took shelter." "Alone?" "Yes." "You are lying!" The accusation hung between them like drawn steel. Selene felt rage rising through the fear. 7 years of suffocation. 7 years of performing. 7 years of being treated like decorative property instead of a human being capable of thoughts and desires that did not revolve around serving the empire. And now he stood before her demanding explanations as if he had earned the right to her honesty through anything other than ownership. "Where I go is my business," she said coldly. Lucien's smile sharpened. "Where my queen goes is always my business, especially when she returns smelling like another man." The world stopped. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Lucien closed the distance between them in 3 strides and gripped her jaw with one hand, tilting her face upward with enough force to hurt without leaving visible marks. His eyes searched hers with the focus of someone looking for cracks in enemy armor. "I have given you everything," he said quietly, his voice terrible in its control. "A crown, an empire, power that women throughout history would have killed to possess. And you repay me with betrayal." Selene jerked her head free. "You have given me nothing but a cage made of gold. Lucien's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist before she could step back. His grip was iron. You knew what this marriage was before you accepted it. Duty, alliance, stability. I never promised you love. Then do not act wounded when I find it elsewhere. The admission came out before she could stop it. Too honest. Too raw. Too late to take back. Lucien went completely still. His expression shifted through several emotions too fast to track. Shock, rage, devastation, calculation, before finally settling on something cold and dangerous. Say his name, he commanded. No, say it. Selene lifted her chin. No. Lucien released her wrist and stepped back, his hands curling into fists at his sides. For a moment she thought he might actually strike her, but instead he turned and walked back toward the fireplace, pouring himself another whiskey with hands that were not quite steady. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something worse than anger, calm, controlled, strategic. I could have you executed for this, he said conversationally. Treason, adultery. Crimes punishable by public death designed to remind the Empire what happens when queens forget their place. He drank. But executing you would only make you a martyr. The beautiful queen murdered by the cruel king. Songs would be written. Rebellions might rise. Your family would have justification to withdraw their support. He turned to face her. So instead, I will give you one chance to end this quietly. Confess. Tell me his name, beg forgiveness, and I will allow you to remain queen on the condition that you never speak to him again. The offer was poison wrapped in mercy. Selene understood immediately that confession would not save her. It would give Lucien exactly what he needed to destroy the man she loved while maintaining the illusion of magnanimous forgiveness. And I refuse? She asked. Then I will find him myself. And when I do, his death will take days instead of seconds. It was not a threat. It was a promise delivered with the casual certainty of a king who had spent years learning exactly how much pain the human body could endure before finally surrendering to darkness. Selene felt ice spread through her chest, because she had just realized something terrible. Lucien did not love her. He never had. But possession ran deeper than love for men like him. Losing her wounded his pride, and wounded pride was far more dangerous than wounded hearts, because pride demanded public restoration through blood and suffering. I need time to think, she said finally. You have until tomorrow night, Lucien replied. After that I stop asking nicely. He walked past her toward the door, pausing just long enough to lean close and whisper against her ear. Choose carefully, my queen, because whatever you decide will determine whether the man you love dies screaming or simply stops breathing. Then he was gone, leaving Selene standing alone in chambers that suddenly felt more like a tomb than a home. She found Kael in the training yards 2 hours later. It was barely dawn, the sky still gray with pre-sunrise light, but he was already awake, sparring against 4 royal guards simultaneously with the kind of brutal efficiency that made even experienced soldiers look clumsy. Sweat soaked through his black training shirt. His movements were precise, controlled, lethal. The guards fell back one by one, breathing hard, until only Kael remained standing in the center of the yard, his chest rising and falling steadily while steam rose from his skin in the cold morning air. That was when he saw her, standing at the edge of the training grounds, watching. His expression shifted immediately. Concern, recognition, understanding. He dismissed the guards with a sharp gesture and crossed the yard toward her, his eyes scanning her face with the focus of someone reading a battlefield report. What happened? He asked quietly. Selene glanced around. The yard was empty now, but the palace had eyes everywhere. Servants, spies, loyalists who reported directly to the king. Not here, she said. Kael nodded once and led her through a series of narrow corridors into the old armory, a stone chamber filled with ancient weapons mounted on walls and racks of outdated armor gathering dust in corners. He closed the heavy door behind them and turned to face her. Tell me. Selene told him everything, Lucien's accusations, his ultimatum, his threat. When she finished, Kael was silent for a long time, his jaw tight, his hands flexed like he was physically restraining himself from immediately marching back toward the royal chambers and tearing the king apart. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. You need to give him my name. Selene felt her heart lurch. No. Selene, I will not sacrifice you to save myself. Kael stepped closer and gripped her shoulders. Listen to me, Lucien is not bluffing. If you refuse, he will start executing people close to you until you break. Servants, guards, anyone he suspects. I have seen him do this before during the border campaigns when he wanted information from captured warlords. His fingers tightened. He will drown this palace in blood just to prove he still controls you. Then we run, Selene said desperately. Tonight, we take horses and disappear before he can stop us. Kael shook his head. There is nowhere in this empire we could hide. Lucien controls every territory, every port, every border crossing. We would be captured within days. Then we go beyond the empire and start a war that would kill thousands, because that is what would happen. Your family would be forced to choose sides. Noble houses would fracture. Lucien would burn entire provinces just to prove no one escapes his reach. Kael's voice cracked. I will not let you destroy yourself for me. Selene grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to look at her. And I will not let him murder you just to restore his wounded pride. For a moment they stood frozen, both understanding the impossible trap they had fallen into. There was no path forward that did not end in blood. Finally, Kael pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her with the desperation of someone trying to hold on to something already slipping away. I should never have touched you, he said hoarsely against her hair. I knew what this would cost, and I did it anyway because I was selfish and weak and so fucking tired of feeling nothing. Selene pressed her face against his chest. You're the only thing that has ever made me feel alive. That does not make it right. I do not care about right anymore. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the dusty silence of the old armory, while the empire they had betrayed continued functioning around them, unaware that the foundation was already cracking. When they finally pulled apart, Kael's expression had shifted into something harder, more resolved. I am going to fix this, he said. How? By doing what I should have done the moment I realized I loved you. Selene felt cold fear spread through her chest. What are you planning? Kael kissed her forehead. Trust me, that is not an answer. His smile was sad. I know. Then he walked out of the armory, leaving Selene standing alone among weapons that had not been used in generations, all of them rusted and broken and useless. Kael went directly to Lucien. The king was in his private study, a room lined with maps and military reports, and expensive whiskey he drank like water. He looked up when Kael entered without knocking, his expression shifting from surprise to cold satisfaction. I wondered how long it would take you to come, Lucien said calmly. Kael closed the door behind him. Leave her alone. The king leaned back in his chair, swirling amber liquid in his crystal glass. So it is you. He said it without surprise, as if he had already known and was simply waiting for confirmation. Kael said nothing. Lucien stood and walked around his desk slowly, studying Kael the way generals studied opponents before battle. My oldest friend, he said quietly. My most trusted general. The man I have relied on for every victory, every conquest, every expansion of this empire. He stopped a few feet away. And you betray me by fucking my wife. The accusation hit like a physical blow, but Kael kept his expression neutral. It was not about betrayal. Then what was it about? Survival. Lucien laughed bitterly. Whose survival? Hers? Yours? Because from where I stand, you have both destroyed yourselves. Kael took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain calm, even though every instinct screamed at him to fight. She was drowning, he said quietly. You were killing her slowly, not through violence, through loneliness, through treating her like decorative property instead of a human being. Lucien's eyes went flat. I gave her everything. You gave her a cage. The king's hand shot out and grabbed Kael by the throat, slamming him back against the wall hard enough to crack plaster. His grip was iron, his face inches away, his breath hot with whiskey and rage. I could kill you right now, Lucien hissed. Snap your neck. Claim you attacked me. No one would question it. Kael did not struggle. Then do it. For a long moment they stayed frozen like that, years of friendship collapsing into pure hatred. Then Lucien released him and stepped back, breathing hard. You want to know the worst part? He said hoarsely. It is not that you took her. It is that she wanted you to. His voice cracked. I have spent years building this empire, conquering territories, crushing rebellions, creating something that will last centuries, and none of it matters because the one thing I actually wanted looks at you the way she should look at me. And there it was. The raw wound beneath all the rage and control and calculated cruelty. Lucien was not angry because his queen had been unfaithful. He was angry because her betrayal proved he was not capable of inspiring genuine love. Only obedience, only fear. And for a man who measured his worth through dominance, that realization was more devastating than any military defeat. Kael straightened, rubbing his throat where Lucien's fingers had left marks. Let her go, he said quietly. Annul the marriage. Let her leave the capital. I will stay. I will serve you. Fight your wars. Conquer your territories. But let her walk away. Lucien stared at him. You would sacrifice yourself for her? Without hesitation. The king smiled, but it held no warmth. That is exactly why I will never agree. He walked back to his desk and poured another whiskey. Here is what is going to happen instead. You will be reassigned to the Western Front immediately. There is a border dispute that requires military attention. You will leave tonight. You will not speak to Selene before you go. You will not send letters. You will not return to the capital until I summon you. His eyes were cold. And if you refuse, I will have her family executed for treason. Her father, her mother, her younger brother. All of them. Publicly. While she watches. Kael felt rage so pure it nearly blinded him. You would murder innocents just to punish her? I would burn entire kingdoms to remind people what happens when they take what belongs to me. Lucien drank. So make your choice, General. Leave quietly, and she lives. Refuse, and everyone she loves dies screaming. There was no choice. There never had been. Kael had walked into this study believing he could negotiate, but kings did not negotiate. They dictated terms and crushed anyone who refused to accept them. I leave tonight, Kael said finally, his voice hollow. Good. Lucien sat back down behind his desk, already dismissing him. And Kael? He looked up. If I ever discover you have contacted her again, I will not kill you quickly. I will make you watch while I destroy her slowly, piece by piece, until she begs for death, and I deny her even that mercy. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Kael turned and walked toward the door, but Lucien's voice stopped him one last time. You know the truly tragic part of all this? I actually loved you like a brother. I trusted you more than anyone else in this empire, and you destroyed that for someone who was never yours to take. His voice was quiet, almost sad. I hope she was worth it. Kael paused at the threshold, his hand on the door. She was worth everything. Then he left, walking out into palace corridors that suddenly felt like they were closing in around him, the walls pressing closer with every step until he could barely breathe. Selene did not see Kael again before he disappeared. One moment he existed inside the palace walls, the next he was gone, erased, as if he had never been there at all. She learned about his reassignment through a servant who mentioned casually that the general had left for the western border on urgent military business. No ceremony, no formal farewell. Just gone. And Selene understood immediately what had happened. Lucien had separated them, not through execution, through exile. A punishment designed to be slow and psychological instead of swift and merciful. She tried sending letters through trusted servants, but every messenger returned empty-handed, claiming the general was unreachable in active war zones. She tried bribing guards for information, but Lucien had clearly ordered complete silence around Kael's location and activities. She tried everything. Nothing worked. And slowly, over the following weeks, Selene felt herself suffocating again beneath the weight of performance and loneliness, and the terrible understanding that she was completely, utterly trapped. Lucien became attentive in the way predators became attentive. He attended every meal with her, accompanied her to every public event, touched her constantly in front of nobles, small gestures designed to project unity and possession. Look how devoted they are, the court whispered. Look how much he loves her. But Selene felt his touches like brands burning into her skin, each one a reminder, each one a warning. You belong to me, his eyes said every time he looked at her. Never forget that. 1 month after Kael's departure, Lucien summoned her to his chambers late at night. She went because refusing was not an option. He was standing near the fireplace again, wearing the same expression he always wore when delivering news designed to hurt. "You are pregnant," he said without preamble. Selene felt the world tilt. "No." The royal physician confirmed it this morning. 6 weeks. That was impossible. She had not been with Lucien and then she understood. The child was not his. It was Kael's. Lucien watched her face shift through horror, realization, and pure terror with the satisfaction of someone who had just won a chess game that had been in progress for years. "Congratulations, my queen," he said softly. "You are going to give me an heir. It is not yours." Lucien smiled. "It will be." He stepped closer. "Here is what is going to happen. You will carry this child to term. You will deliver it healthy, and you will never speak of its true parentage to anyone. As far as the Empire is concerned, this is my son, my legacy, proof of our perfect marriage." His hand settled on her stomach with terrible gentleness. "And if you refuse, I will have the child cut from your body the moment it is born and raised by servants while you watch from a cell designed specifically to keep treasonous queens alive but broken." Selene could not breathe, could not think, could not process the enormity of the trap that had just closed around her completely. "Why?" she whispered. "Why not just kill me and be done with it?" Lucien's expression was almost pitying, because death would be mercy. "And I am not feeling merciful." He walked toward the door, pausing at the threshold. "I am announcing your pregnancy at the Empire Ascension Ball next week. Every major house will attend. It will be a celebration of dynastic continuity and royal strength." He looked back at her. "Try to look happy." Then he left, and Selene collapsed to the floor, her hands pressed against her stomach where new life was growing, life that had been created from love but would now be weaponized into the ultimate cage. Because kings did not just possess women, they possessed futures, and Lucien had just claimed hers completely. The Empire Ascension Ball was exactly the kind of suffocating spectacle Selene had learned to hate. Thousands of candles burning in crystal chandeliers. Every major alpha house represented. Foreign diplomats. Military commanders. Nobles dressed in silks and jewels that cost more than most families earned in lifetimes. And at the center of it all, King Lucien Draven stood on the raised dais with his queen beside him, addressing the gathered crowd with the kind of theatrical charisma that made even his enemies respect him. Selene wore a gown the color of blood. It had not been her choice. Lucien had selected it personally. "Red for passion," he had told her while servants laced her into the dress. "Red so everyone remembers you are mine." Now she stood beside him feeling like an exhibit in a museum of things owned by powerful men. The king's speech built slowly toward the announcement everyone had been anticipating, his words designed to inspire loyalty and project strength. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the Empire's continued expansion, but the promise of its future," he declared, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent hall. "A future secured through bloodline and dynasty." He reached for Selene's hand. She forced herself not to flinch. "It is my honor to announce that Queen Selene carries the next heir to the Blackthorne throne." The hall erupted. Applause, cheers, celebration. Nobles rushed forward offering congratulations. Musicians began playing triumphant melodies. Servants poured champagne. And through it all, Selene stood frozen, smiling the way queens were supposed to smile, while inside her chest something was dying slowly. Because she finally understood the full scope of Lucien's revenge. He had not just separated her from Kael. He had turned their love into his greatest weapon. The child she carried, the physical proof of her affair, would now be raised as the king's son, trained to rule, molded in Lucien's image, forever connected to the man who had caused all this suffering. And she would spend the rest of her life watching the evidence of her betrayal, grow up believing the wrong man was his father. It was psychological torture disguised as mercy. It was brilliant, it was monstrous, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Later that night, after the celebration had finally ended and nobles had scattered back to their estates drunk on expensive wine and political positioning, Selene stood alone on a balcony overlooking the capital. Snow was falling again. The city looked peaceful from this height, almost beautiful. She pressed one hand against her stomach where life was growing. "I am sorry," she whispered to the child who could not yet hear her. "I'm so sorry," a voice spoke behind her. "You should be inside." The cold is not good for the baby. Selene turned. Lucien stood in the doorway, silhouetted against golden light spilling from the hall behind him. For a moment neither spoke. Then the king stepped forward onto the balcony, standing beside her at the railing. "You hate me," he observed quietly. "Yes." "Good." He looked out at the city below. "Hate is honest. I can work with hate. It was your love for him that I could not tolerate." Selene said nothing. Lucien continued, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Do you want to know something true? I did not plan any of this. The separation, the pregnancy announcement, the public claim. All of it happened because I am a petty, wounded man who cannot stand losing." He laughed bitterly. "They call me a great king, a brilliant strategist, a leader who built an empire that will last centuries. But strip away the crown and the throne and the armies, and all that remains is a deeply insecure man terrified that he is fundamentally unlovable." Selene looked at him in shock, because this was the first time in 7 years she had heard him speak without calculation or performance, just raw honesty. He met her eyes. "I know I destroyed any chance we had. I know this marriage is a grave you are forced to inhabit. And I know that child you carry looks at me as a monster who stole their mother's happiness." His jaw tightened. "But I will raise them anyway, teach them to rule, give them everything I never had, because legacy is all men like me have left when love becomes impossible." He turned to walk back inside, but paused at the threshold one final time. "For what it is worth, I hope you find a way to forgive yourself, not for the affair, but for whatever comes next." Then he disappeared into the palace, leaving Selene standing alone in the snow, his words echoing in her mind like a warning she did not yet understand. Whatever comes next? What did that mean? She would not learn the answer for 3 more months, but when she finally did, it would destroy everything. Because the most dangerous moment in any war is not the battle itself. It is the moment when someone decides they have nothing left to lose. 3 months passed like a slow execution. Selene's body changed in ways she could not control. Her stomach swelled. Morning sickness came in waves that left her weak and trembling. The child growing inside her felt less like a blessing and more like a constant reminder of everything she had lost. Kael remained at the Western Front. No letters, no contact, just silence that felt like drowning. Lucien, meanwhile, transformed into the perfect doting husband for public consumption. He attended every physician appointment, commissioned artists to paint portraits of the expectant royal couple, made speeches about legacy and dynasty that had nobles weeping with pride. But in private, he barely looked at her. Their chambers felt like a mausoleum where 2 people existed in parallel without ever actually touching. Selene spent her days walking through palace corridors like a ghost, her hand pressed against her stomach, whispering apologies to a child who would grow up believing lies were truth, and truth was treason. She was standing in the royal gardens one afternoon, watching snow fall onto frozen rose bushes, when a servant approached with unusual urgency. "Your Majesty," the young woman said quietly, her eyes darting nervously toward the palace guards stationed along the garden walls. "There is someone who needs to speak with you, privately." Selene turned. "Who?" The servant pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand and disappeared before Selene could ask anything else. She unfolded it carefully. 4 words written in handwriting she recognized immediately. Northern Tower, midnight, alone. Kael's handwriting. Selene's heart stopped, then restarted at triple speed. He was here, in the palace, against every order, against all logic, and she knew with terrible certainty that whatever happened at midnight would change everything. The hours before midnight stretched like torture. Selene moved through dinner with Lucien in a haze, barely tasting food, responding to his occasional comments with automatic politeness while her mind raced through possibilities. How had Kael gotten into the palace without being seen? Why would he risk everything to return? What could be so urgent that he would break Lucien's explicit command and walk directly into enemy territory? The king noticed her distraction. "You are quiet tonight," he observed, cutting into roasted meat with surgical precision. "I am tired. You are always tired." His eyes studied her face. "Or perhaps you are thinking about something else. Someone else." Selene forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "I am thinking about our child." It was not entirely a lie. Lucien's expression softened slightly. Not with affection, but with the satisfaction of possession temporarily confirmed. "Good," he said. "That is where your focus should remain." He returned to his meal, and Selene felt relief wash through her that he had accepted the deflection. But deep down, she wondered if kings ever truly accepted anything, or if they simply waited for the right moment to reveal they had known the truth all along. After dinner, she retreated to her chambers under the excuse of exhaustion. Servants helped her undress and disappear, leaving her alone in rooms that felt simultaneously too large and too suffocating. She waited until the palace fell silent, until guard rotations shifted, until the only sounds were distant footsteps and wind rattling windows. Then she wrapped herself in a dark cloak and slipped into the corridor, moving through shadows with the practiced stealth of someone who had learned to navigate a prison disguised as a palace. The northern tower was old, abandoned, forgotten by everyone except maintenance staff who checked structural stability once per season. Selene climbed the narrow stone staircase carefully, her hand trailing along the cold wall for balance, her breath coming in shallow gasps because pregnancy had made even simple movement exhausting. When she finally reached the top, she pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into a circular room lit by a single oil lamp sitting on the floor. Kael stood near the window, still wearing black military leathers, still carrying that same exhausted intensity that made him look like a man who had stopped sleeping months ago. But something was different. His eyes. They looked haunted, desperate, almost broken. "You came," he said quietly. Selene closed the door behind her. "You should not be here. I know. Lucien will kill you if he discovers this. I know that too. Then why risk it?" Kael crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms with such sudden force it knocked the breath from her lungs. He buried his face against her neck, his entire body shaking. And Selene realized with sharp horror that he was crying. Kael Varyn, the undefeated wolf, the Empire's most feared general, crying like a man who had finally reached the absolute limit of what a human being could endure. "I cannot do this anymore," he said hoarsely against her skin. "I cannot stay away. I cannot pretend you do not exist. I cannot survive knowing you are trapped here carrying our child while he claims it as his own." Selene held him tighter. "We do not have a choice. Everyone has a choice. Not us." Kael pulled back enough to look at her, his hands framing her face with desperate gentleness. "Run away with me," he said. "Tonight. Right now. I have horses waiting outside the southern wall. We can be gone before anyone notices." Selene felt her heart breaking. Because she wanted it so badly, the desire felt like physical pain. But running meant war. It meant her family executed for treason. It meant the Empire collapsing into civil conflict that would kill thousands. She pressed her forehead against his. "We cannot." "Then what do we do?" Kael asked, his voice cracking. "Spend the rest of our lives pretending we do not love each other while your husband uses our child as a weapon?" Selene had no answer, because there was no good answer. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the dim lamplight, both understanding they were trapped inside a situation with no escape routes and no mercy. Finally, Kael spoke again, his voice steadier but somehow worse. "There is another option." Selene pulled back to look at him. "What?" His expression was terrible. "I kill him." The words hung in the air like drawn steel. Selene felt ice spread through her chest. "That is treason. So is what we have already done. It is also murder. It is survival." Kael's hands tightened on her shoulders. "Lucien will never let you go. He will spend the rest of his life torturing you emotionally just to prove he still owns you. And when our child is born, he will raise them to hate everything we are." His jaw clenched. "Unless we remove him first." Selene stepped back, her mind reeling. "You are talking about killing the king. I am talking about killing a tyrant. He will be replaced by another tyrant. The noble houses will tear each other apart fighting for the throne. The empire will collapse. Not if I take the crown." Selene stared at him. "You. I am his most successful general. The military respects me. The common people know my name. If Lucien dies during an accident or conflict, I am the logical successor. This is insane. This is the only path forward." Kael grabbed her hands. "Think about it, Selene. No more cages, no more performance, no more pretending. We could rule together. Not as king and decorative queen, but as partners. We could rebuild this empire into something better than what Lucien created. And you think the noble houses would accept that? They would accept strength, and I am very good at projecting strength. His eyes burned with something between desperation and determination. Say yes. Tell me you want this. Give me permission to end him. Selene felt her world tilting, because part of her wanted exactly what he was offering: freedom, love, a chance to escape the suffocating cage her life had become. But another part understood the cost. Murdering Lucien meant blood on her hands forever. It meant becoming exactly the kind of person she had always despised, someone who used violence to solve problems that should have been solved through honesty and courage years earlier. And it meant raising their child in an empire built on patricide and betrayal. I need time to think, she whispered. We do not have time. Then I need you to give it to me anyway. Kael's expression cracked. Selene, please. He released her hands and stepped back, running his fingers through his hair with the frustration of someone who had built an entire plan around a single conversation going differently. You have 3 days, he said finally. After that, I act with or without your blessing. Do not do this. I am already doing it. Then you are doing it alone. Selene turned toward the door, but Kael's voice stopped her. He killed my lieutenant last week. She froze. Kael continued, his voice hollow. Marcus. Good man. Loyal soldier. Saved my life twice during the northern campaigns. Lucien had him executed for suspected communication with me. No trial. No evidence. Just a public beheading designed to send a message. He stepped closer. That is who you are protecting. A man who murders innocent people just to maintain control. So forgive me if I do not share your moral concerns about removing him permanently. Selene looked back at him and saw something that terrified her more than Lucien's threats ever had. Kael was not just angry, he was resolved. The decision had already been made. Her permission was a formality he had hoped to receive but no longer required. 3 days? He repeated. Then he blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and disappeared through a door she had not noticed earlier, some hidden passage that servants used centuries ago when the tower still functioned. Selene stood alone in the blackness, her hand pressed against her stomach, feeling the child inside her shift and move. And she understood with terrible clarity that she was standing at a crossroads where every path led to destruction. Support Kael and become complicit in murder. Refuse and watch him execute the plan anyway, possibly getting himself killed in the process. Or warn Lucien and condemn Kael to the kind of death that would haunt her nightmares forever. There were no good choices left, only different flavors of catastrophe. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she paced her chambers until dawn, her mind racing through scenarios and outcomes, all of them ending in blood. By morning, she had made a decision. She would warn Lucien, not to protect him, but to protect Kael from his own desperation. Because men who believed themselves trapped made reckless choices that got them killed, and she could not survive watching the man she loved die, knowing she could have prevented it. She found the king in the throne room, reviewing military reports with his council of advisors. He looked up when she entered, his expression shifting from political focus to mild surprise. "Leave us," he commanded. The advisors filed out quickly. When they were alone, Lucien descended from his throne and approached her with that same predatory grace he always carried. "You look terrible," he observed. "Did you sleep?" "No." "Why not?" Selene took a breath. "Because Kael is planning to kill you." The throne room fell absolutely silent. Lucien's expression did not change. He simply stood there, studying her face with the kind of terrible focus that made her feel like he was reading every thought she had ever had. Finally, he spoke. "I know." Selene felt the world tilt. "What?" "I have known for weeks. My spies intercepted correspondence, tracked his movements, documented every step of his ridiculous little plot." Lucien smiled without warmth. "Did you really think I would let him wander back into the palace without supervision? Then why did you not stop him?" "Because I wanted to see what you would do." He stepped closer. "Would you support him, encourage the assassination, or would you come to me?" This was a test. The realization hit like cold water. The entire midnight meeting had been observed, every word recorded, every gesture catalogued. Lucien had allowed it all to happen just to measure her loyalty. Selene felt rage so pure it nearly choked her. You used me as bait. I used you as exactly what you are, a woman torn between duty and desire. And now I know which one you chose. His hand settled on her shoulder. You chose duty. You came to me. You warned me about the threat. He leaned close. That was the correct decision. Selene jerked away from his touch. What are you going to do to him? Lucien's smile widened. Absolutely nothing. She stared at him in confusion. Nothing? I am going to let him try. That makes no sense. Lucien walked back toward his throne, settling into it with the casual confidence of someone who had already won a game his opponents did not know they were playing. Here's what is going to happen, he said conversationally. In 2 days, there is a Winter Sovereign Summit. Every major house attends. Foreign diplomats, military commanders. The entire power structure of this empire gathered in one place. He steepled his fingers. Kael will attempt his assassination during the chaos of the celebration. My guards will intercept him. There will be a public trial. Evidence of treason. Confessions extracted through methods I prefer not to describe in detail. His eyes went cold. And then I will execute him in front of everyone who ever believed he was untouchable. The undefeated wolf. Brought down not by enemies, but by his own arrogance and lust. Selene felt horror spreading through her chest like poison. You're going to make an example of him. I'm going to remind the Empire what happens when generals forget their place. She stepped forward. He will not attempt it if I warn him. Lucien laughed. You think he will listen? He is past listening. He is desperate. Desperate men do not change plans. They charge forward believing conviction alone will carry them through. He stood. And even if you did warn him, my guards will arrest him anyway. The moment he entered this palace, he committed treason. The assassination plot is simply better theater. Selene felt everything inside her collapse. Because Lucien had not just anticipated Kael's plan, he had engineered the entire situation to ensure maximum public humiliation and control. There was no escape. There never had been. Please, she whispered, hating herself for begging but unable to stop. Do not do this. Give me one reason why I should show mercy. Because I am carrying his child. The words came out before she could stop them. Raw, honest, desperate. Lucien went very still. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, rage, and something that looked almost like devastation before finally settling on cold calculation. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. Say that again. The baby is his, not yours. I have known since the moment the physician confirmed it. Tears were streaming down her face now. So kill me instead. Execute me for treason. Make your example from me. But let him live. Lucien descended from his throne slowly and stopped inches away from her, his presence suffocating. You think I did not already know? He asked softly. You think I did not do the calculations myself? Count the weeks? Recognize the timeline. His hand moved to her stomach. I have always known this child was not mine. Then why claim it? Because claiming it hurts you more than executing you ever could. He leaned close enough that she could feel his breath against her ear. Every time you look at your son, you will remember that I stole him. Every time he calls me father, you will die a little more inside. Every time he grows to love me instead of hate me, you will understand exactly how completely I won. His voice was venom wrapped in silk. That is a better revenge than your death could ever provide. Selene felt something inside her break completely. Because she finally understood the full scope of Lucien's cruelty. He was not interested in quick vengeance. He was interested in prolonged suffering. And he had just described a future where she would spend decades watching her own child become a weapon designed specifically to torture her. She pulled away from him and walked toward the throne room doors on legs that barely supported her weight. Where are you going? Lucien called after her. Selene did not turn around. To fix this. Her voice was hollow, empty, changed. You cannot fix this, the king said. It is already done. But Selene was already gone, moving through palace corridors with new purpose, burning through the exhaustion and fear and suffocating helplessness that had paralyzed her for months. Because Lucien had made a critical mistake in his calculations. He had assumed she would continue choosing duty over desire, survival over risk, the cage over freedom. But there is a point where human beings stop calculating costs and simply act, where fear transforms into rage, where trapped animals become dangerous. Lucien had pushed her past that point, and now he was about to learn what happened when queens decided they had nothing left to lose. She found Kael in the old armory again, sharpening a blade, preparing. He looked up when she entered, his expression shifting from surprise to concern when he saw her face. What happened? Lucien knows, she said flatly. He has always known, the entire plan, every detail. He is letting you walk into a trap. Kael went very still. How long has he known? Weeks, maybe longer. Then why has he not acted? Because he wants you to try. He wants to arrest you publicly during the summit, make an example, execute you in front of the entire empire. Kael set down the blade carefully. Then I will not give him that satisfaction. I will leave tonight, disappear into territories he cannot reach. Selene shook her head. He will hunt you forever. And even if you escape, he will take his revenge on everyone else. My family, your soldiers, anyone he even suspects helped you. Then what do you suggest? Her voice was cold, steady, resolved. We kill him first, tonight, before the summit, before his guards are prepared, before he can orchestrate his public spectacle. Kael stared at her. You said this was insane. It is insane, but it is also our only option. She stepped closer. You were right. Lucien will never stop. He will spend the rest of his life torturing both of us just to prove he can. The only way this ends is if we end him. Are you certain? Selene thought about the child growing inside her, about a future spent watching her son raised by a man who viewed love as weakness and control as strength, about decades of suffocation and performance and slow emotional death. Yes, she said finally, I am certain. Kael studied her face for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not relief, something sadder, almost like grief, because they both understood what they were about to become. Murderers. Traitors. Exactly the kind of people history would remember as villains instead of victims. But survival required ugliness, and they had finally run out of clean options. How do we do this? Kael asked quietly. Selene pulled a small vial from inside her cloak. Poison. Fast-acting. Odorless. I stole it from the royal physician's stores. She held it up to the lamplight. I put this in his wine during our private dinner tonight. He dies quickly. We claim natural causes. Heart failure. The stress of ruling. By the time anyone questions it, you will already be positioned to assume the throne. And your moral objections? Selene's smile was bitter. Morality is a luxury afforded to people who have choices. We do not. Kael reached out and pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with the desperate tenderness of someone trying to memorize a moment before everything changed forever. I am sorry it came to this, he whispered against her hair. Selene pressed her face against his chest. So am I. They stood like that until the lamp burned low. Then Kael released her and stepped back, his expression hardening into something military and cold. Tonight, then. Tonight, she confirmed. And if something goes wrong, then we die together. Kael smiled faintly. I can live with that. Selene turned to leave, but his voice stopped her one last time. Do you think we will ever forgive ourselves for this? She looked back at him. No. But maybe we will survive long enough that forgiveness stops mattering. Then she walked out of the armory and back toward the royal chambers where a king sat waiting, completely unaware that his queen had just transformed from prisoner into executioner. Because the most dangerous moment in any war is not when weapons are drawn. It is when someone who has spent years enduring finally decides they are done surviving and ready to fight. And Selene Draven was done surviving. The dinner was set for 8. Selene spent the afternoon preparing herself the way soldiers prepared for battle, methodically, coldly, pushing aside every emotion that might interfere with execution. She bathed, dressed in a gown the color of midnight that Lucien had once told her made her look like a queen carved from shadow. Applied cosmetics with steady hands, even though her heart was trying to hammer its way through her ribs. And finally, she tucked the small glass vial of poison into a hidden pocket sewn into the fabric near her hip. One vial, clear liquid, no smell, no taste, death disguised as water. The royal physician had kept it locked away for years, a relic from older times when political marriages ended more frequently through convenient accidents than divorces. Selene had stolen it 3 days earlier during a routine pregnancy examination, slipping it into her sleeve while the physician's back was turned. Now it felt like it was burning through fabric directly into her skin. A reminder, a promise, a point of no return. When she finally walked into the private dining chamber where Lucien waited, she found him already seated at the head of the table, wearing formal black with silver threading that caught candlelight like captured stars. He looked up when she entered, and something flickered across his expression. Not suspicion, something closer to melancholy. "You look beautiful," he said quietly. Selene took her seat across from him. "Thank you." Servants began bringing food: roasted pheasant, winter vegetables glazed with honey, fresh bread still warm from ovens, wine poured into crystal goblets that reflected firelight like blood. They ate in silence for the first several minutes, the only sounds coming from silverware against porcelain and logs crackling in the fireplace. Finally, Lucien spoke. "I have been thinking about what you said this morning." Selene kept her voice neutral. "What part?" "About the child." Her hand tightened on her fork. Lucien continued, his eyes fixed on his wine. "You were right to tell me. Honesty, even when it costs everything, is a rare quality, especially in royal courts where lies are currency and truth is treason." He looked up at her. "I respect that, even if I hate what it revealed." Selene said nothing, because she did not trust her voice. Lucien took a drink, then set his glass down carefully. "I have decided something." "What?" "When the child is born, I will not claim it as my heir." Selene felt shock ripple through her. "What?" Lucien's expression was unreadable. "You were correct. Raising another man's son as my own while pretending otherwise would be a cruelty that serves no one. Not you, not the child, not even me." He paused. "So instead, I am going to dissolve our marriage." The words hung in the air like smoke. Selene stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "You're releasing me?" "Not releasing. Exiling." His voice was flat. "You will leave the capital after the child is born. Go somewhere distant, somewhere I will never have to see you again. Raise your son however you choose. I will provide resources, protection, but you will never return here, and you will never speak of this marriage again. Why? Because keeping you destroys me a little more every day." The admission was raw, honest, devastating. Lucien stood and walked toward the fireplace, his back to her. "I thought I could turn possession into love through sheer force of will. I thought if I controlled every aspect of your life, eventually you would stop fighting and accept that we belong together." He laughed bitterly. "But you cannot force someone to love you. You can only force them to fear you. And I am tired of being feared by the one person whose affection I actually wanted." Selene felt tears burning behind her eyes, because this was the first time in 7 years she had heard him speak without calculation or performance or strategic positioning, just a man admitting defeat. "What about Kael?" she asked quietly. Lucien's shoulders tightened. "He still dies. That does not change." "Why?" "Because he took something that was mine, and kings do not forgive theft. Even if you are letting me go, especially if I am letting you go." He turned to face her, and his expression was terrible. "You get freedom. He gets execution. That is the price of your affair. One of you survives, one of you burns." His voice went cold. "And you do not get to choose which." Selene felt the vial pressing against her hip, heavy, waiting. She could stop this right now. Tell Lucien the plan, save Kael through confession, accept exile and raise their child far from the empire that had suffocated her for 7 years. It was mercy. It was freedom. It was everything she thought she wanted, but it also meant watching Kael die. And she realized in that moment that she would rather burn beside him than survive without him. Some loves were worth more than survival. Some people were worth more than freedom. And Kael Varyn was worth everything. She stood slowly and walked toward Lucien, her hand drifting toward the hidden pocket. "You're a better man than I gave you credit for," she said softly. Lucien smiled without warmth. "No, I am just a tired man who finally understands when he is lost. He reached for his wine glass. And Selene made her choice. Her hand closed around the vial, but before she could move, the dining chamber doors exploded inward with enough force to splinter wood against stone. Royal guards flooded into the room, 6 of them, 8, 10, all wearing the silver armor of Lucien's personal protection unit, and leading them was Kael Varyn, covered in blood and breathing hard, a sword gripped in his right hand that dripped red onto marble floors. Selene felt her entire world stop. Behind Kael, she could see bodies, guards, servants, people who had been stationed outside the dining chamber now lying in spreading pools of their own blood. He had not waited. He had not trusted the plan. He had simply attacked. Lucien moved with shocking speed, grabbing Selene and pulling her behind him with one hand while his other reached for the ceremonial dagger he always wore at his belt. "Stand down, General," the king commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos. Kael stepped further into the room, and Selene finally saw his face clearly. It was not rage. It was not desperation. It was resignation. The expression of a man who had already accepted he was going to die but wanted to take his target with him. "You were going to let her poison me," Kael said flatly. "You knew about the vial. You have known all along. This entire dinner was theater designed to make her commit murder while you watched." Lucien's grip on Selene tightened. "Clever of you to figure that out. Less clever to storm my chambers and slaughter my guards." "I am done being clever." Kael raised his sword. "And I am done letting you control our lives." The remaining guards moved to intercept, but Kael was already in motion, his blade flashing through candlelight as he cut through them with the brutal efficiency of someone who had spent years turning violence into art. Blood sprayed across walls. Bodies fell. And through it all, Lucien held Selene behind him like a shield, his dagger now pressed against her throat. "One more step and I open her neck," the king snarled. Kael froze. For a long moment, the 3 of them stood locked in place, a tableau of betrayal and desperation and love twisted into something unrecognizable. Then Selene spoke, her voice surprisingly steady despite the blade against her skin. "Let him go." Lucien laughed harshly. "Why would I do that?" "Because I'm the one you want to hurt." The king's grip tightened. "I want to hurt both of you, then hurt me, kill me. But let him walk away." Kael's voice cut through like steel. "Do not do this." Selene ignored him, her eyes locked on Lucien's reflection in the window beside them. "You said you were tired of being feared by the one person whose affection you wanted. Prove it. Show me you are capable of mercy instead of possession." Lucien was silent for a long moment. Then he laughed, a sound so broken it barely resembled human emotion. "You think mercy will make you love me?" "No, but it might make you worth remembering as something other than a monster." The blade pressed harder against her throat, and Selene felt warm blood beginning to trickle down her neck. Then Lucien released her, shoved her forward hard enough that she stumbled. "Go," he said hoarsely. "Both of you, leave this empire. Leave this capital. Leave my sight." Kael did not move. "This is a trap. It is surrender." The king dropped his dagger, the metal clattering against marble. "I am done fighting for someone who will never choose me. So take her. Raise your bastard child somewhere I will never have to see either of you again." His voice cracked. "And live with the knowledge that your love cost hundreds of lives tonight." Selene looked at the bodies scattered throughout the room. Guards who had only been doing their duty, servants who had been caught in crossfire, blood everywhere, so much blood. And she understood with horrible clarity what Kael had become in his desperation to save her. A monster. Just like Lucien. Just like her. Because that was what love did when it collided with power. It turned good people into killers. Kael reached for her hand. "We need to leave. Now." Selene looked back at Lucien one final time. The king stood alone in the center of his destroyed dining chamber, surrounded by death, his face a mask of devastation and rage, and something that looked almost like relief. He met her eyes. "I loved you," he said quietly. "In my own broken way, I loved you more than I have ever loved anything." "I know," Selene whispered. Then she turned and ran. Kael pulled her through palace corridors, past more bodies, past guards who were just now realizing something had gone catastrophically wrong, past servants screaming and nobles emerging from their chambers demanding answers. They burst through a side entrance into the freezing night air, where horses were waiting exactly as Kael had promised weeks earlier. He lifted her onto one with surprising gentleness given the violence still coating his hands, then mounted his own. "Where are we going?" Selene asked. "Anywhere but here." They rode hard through capital streets, slick with fresh snow, the palace bells beginning to ring behind them in alarm, the sound chasing them like judgment they could never outrun. And Selene realized they were no longer queen and general. They were fugitives, murderers, traitors whose names would be cursed throughout history. But they were together, and somehow, impossibly, that still mattered more than everything they had destroyed to reach this moment. They rode for 3 days, stopping only when the horses could not continue, sleeping in frozen forests and abandoned hunting lodges, eating whatever they could scavenge, moving steadily away from the capital and toward the northern borders where Lucien's reach grew thinner. Kael barely spoke. The violence had changed something inside him. Selene could see it in his eyes, guilt and horror warring with desperate relief that they had survived. On the 4th morning, they stopped near a frozen river to let the horses drink, and Selene finally broke the silence that had been suffocating them since the escape. "You killed them all." Kael did not look at her. "I did what was necessary. That was not necessary. That was slaughter. They would have killed me." "So you killed them first?" "Yes." His voice was flat, hollow, and I would do it again. Selene stepped closer to him. "What happened to the man who believed power should protect the weak?" "He died the moment I decided you were worth more than my principles." Kael finally looked at her, and his expression was devastated. "I became exactly what I swore I would never be. A man who uses violence to solve problems that should have been solved through courage and honesty years earlier." He turned back toward the river. "Your husband was right. We are monsters now." "Then we are monsters together," Selene said quietly. She moved to stand beside him at the water's edge. "I do not regret what we did. I regret how we did it. But I do not regret choosing you, even knowing the cost, especially knowing the cost." For a long moment they stood in silence, watching their breath turn to mist in the frozen air. Then Kael spoke again, his voice rough. "There is something you need to know." "What?" "Lucien is not going to let us disappear quietly. By now he will have sent riders, trackers, hunters. Every soldier in the Empire will be searching for us." His jaw tightened. "We cannot run forever." Selene felt her hand drift to her stomach, where the child continued growing despite the chaos and violence and impossible circumstances. "Then we stop running." "And do what?" "Build an army." Kael looked at her sharply. "You want to fight him?" "I want to finish what we started. We cannot spend the rest of our lives hiding, and we cannot raise this child as fugitives." Her voice was cold, hard, changed. "So we go north, find territories that still resist imperial control, gather forces, build support." Her eyes met his. "And we take the throne that should have been yours from the beginning. That is treason. We crossed that line the moment we fell in love inside his palace." Selene stepped closer. "You are the Empire's greatest general. The soldiers love you. The common people know your name. If anyone can challenge Lucien's rule, it is you. And if we fail, then we die fighting instead of running." She touched his face. "I am done surviving, Kael. I want to win." For the first time since the escape, something flickered in Kael's eyes. Not hope exactly, but purpose. The thing that had kept him alive through years of war and death and impossible odds. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with desperate strength. "If we do this, there is no going back. We will be starting a civil war. Thousands will die. The Empire will fracture. I know. You will be remembered as the queen who destroyed everything for selfish love. Then I will be remembered honestly." Kael pressed his forehead against hers. "I wish I had met you in a different life, one where we could have loved each other without burning kingdoms down." Selene smiled sadly. "But we did not get that life. We got this one. Then we make it worth the cost." "Yes." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other beside frozen water while smoke from distant fires began rising on the horizon. Because news was spreading. The queen had fled, the general had betrayed his king, and the empire they had both served was beginning to tear itself apart along fracture lines that had always existed beneath the surface, just waiting for someone to apply enough pressure to break everything. Far behind them, back in the capital, Lucien Draven stood alone in his throne room, staring at reports flooding in from scouts and spies and loyalists. The northern territories were mobilizing. Border lords were declaring support for Kael. Common soldiers were deserting, and merchants were already betting on civil war becoming inevitable within months. The king crushed the latest report in his fist, his knuckles white, his jaw tight with rage so pure it felt like it might consume him entirely. He had given them mercy, offered them escape, and they had repaid him with rebellion. Around him, his advisors waited nervously for orders. Finally, Lucien spoke, his voice cold and absolutely controlled. Mobilize the full imperial army. Call in every favor. Activate every alliance. Empty the treasury if necessary. He looked up. I want them found. I want them brought back alive. His smile was terrible. And then I want to make them watch while I burn their rebellion to ash and salt the earth where it tried to grow. One advisor cleared his throat nervously. Your Majesty, if I may ask, why not simply execute them when we capture them? Why bring them back alive? Because death is mercy. Lucien stood, his presence filling the throne room like pressure before a storm. And I am done showing mercy. Outside the palace windows, snow was beginning to fall again, but this time it looked less like peace and more like the ash that would eventually cover everything once the fires truly began burning. Because empires do not collapse quietly. They collapse in blood and screaming and the kind of violence that historians spend centuries trying to understand. And the Blackthorne Empire was about to learn exactly what happened when love, betrayal, and power collided with enough force to shatter foundations built over generations. The war was coming, and no one would survive it unchanged. The civil war lasted 18 months. Not the quick, decisive conflict Kael had hoped for, but a slow, grinding devastation that consumed the empire from within like rot spreading through ancient timber. Territory by territory, the kingdom fractured. Northern lords declared for Kael, bringing their armies and their anger at decades of exploitation under Lucien's rule. Common soldiers deserted imperial garrisons, choosing loyalty to the general who had fought beside them over fear of the king who had only watched from distant thrones. Merchant guilds split their allegiances based on trade routes and old grudges, turning economic disputes into military ones. The empire became a chessboard where every move cost lives, and every victory felt hollow because it came soaked in the blood of people who should never have been forced to choose sides. Selene watched it all from fortified northern strongholds, her stomach growing larger with each passing month while the world burned around her. She had thought she understood the cost of rebellion. She had been wrong. The cost was not measured in battles won or territories claimed. It was measured in farmers whose fields became graveyards, children who lost parents to wars they did not understand, entire villages erased because they happened to sit on strategically valuable land. Every night, Kael returned from command meetings carrying the weight of decisions no human being should have to make. Which town to defend? Which supply line to abandon? How many soldiers to sacrifice to buy time for civilians to evacuate? He stopped sleeping, stopped eating regularly, stopped being anything except the weapon he had spent his entire life trying not to become. And Selene watched the man she loved disappear slowly into something harder, colder, more ruthless than Lucien had ever been. Because war did not care about intentions. It only cared about survival. One winter evening, 8 months into the conflict, she found him standing alone on the battlements of their northern fortress, staring out at fires burning on the horizon where imperial forces had just destroyed 3 villages suspected of harboring rebel sympathizers. She stood beside him in silence for a long time before speaking. How many dead? Kael's voice was hollow. We estimate 400, maybe more. The reports are still incomplete. Selene felt her hand drift to her stomach, where their son kicked and moved, blissfully unaware of the hell he was being born into. This has to end, she said quietly. It will. Eventually. When one of us is completely destroyed, that is not an ending. That is annihilation. Kael finally looked at her, and his eyes were dead. What would you have me do? Surrender? Let Lucien execute us both while the Empire watches? No. But there has to be another way. There is no other way. This is what rebellion looks like. This is what freedom costs. His voice cracked. And every night I lie awake wondering if you were worth it. The words hit like a physical blow. Selene stepped back, her throat tight. Do you regret it? Regret us? Kael turned away. I regret that loving you meant destroying everything I spent my life building. I regret that our son will be born into a kingdom so broken it might never heal. I regret that the soldiers who followed me did so believing I was better than Lucien. And now I have become exactly what he was. Then end it, Selene said, her voice shaking. Call for a truce. Negotiate terms. Lucien does not negotiate. You have not tried, because trying would mean admitting we were wrong. And if we were wrong, then every person who has died fighting for us died for nothing. He turned back to her, his expression tortured. So we keep fighting, we keep killing, we keep pretending this is noble instead of monstrous, because stopping now would mean facing what we have actually done. And for the first time since the escape, Selene understood the full weight of their choices. They had not started a revolution. They had started a slaughter. And there was no way to undo it without admitting that love, no matter how genuine, was not justification for the destruction of thousands of innocent lives. Bulk. The breaking point came during the siege of Carveth Crossing, a critical river passage that controlled access to the southern territories. Lucien had fortified it with his best remaining troops and enough supplies to hold out for months. Kael needed it to continue his advance toward the capital. The siege stretched on for weeks, both sides bleeding resources and soldiers in brutal daily skirmishes that accomplished nothing except filling mass graves. Then scouts brought word that Imperial reinforcements were moving north. 5,000 fresh troops, heavy cavalry, siege equipment, enough force to crush Kael's army between the fortification and the arriving reinforcements like grain between millstones. His advisors gathered in the command tent, arguing strategies with the desperate energy of men who knew they were losing. We retreat, one said. Preserve the army, fight another day. Retreating means abandoning every territory we have gained, another countered. We lose everything. Then we attack now, a third insisted. Break through before the reinforcements arrive. That is suicide. The fortifications are too strong. The argument spiraled in circles, each option worse than the last, until finally Kael slammed his fist against the table hard enough to crack wood. Everyone fell silent. He stood there breathing hard, his jaw tight, his eyes wild with exhaustion and desperation, and the terrible understanding that he was out of good choices. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet. Controlled. Frightening. We negotiate. The tent erupted in shocked protests. Negotiate with Lucien? He will never agree. He will execute you the moment you lower your guard. This is madness. Kael raised one hand and the protests died. I am going to the capital, alone, under flag of truce, and I am going to offer Lucien exactly what he has wanted from the beginning. His eyes were dead. Me. The Met. Selene was in their private quarters when Kael told her the plan. She was 8 months pregnant now, moving slowly, her body heavy with the weight of impending birth and accumulated exhaustion from months of living in war zones. When she heard what he intended to do, she felt her entire world collapse. No. It is the only way to end this. It is suicide. It is surrender. Kael crossed the room and knelt before her, taking her hands in his with heartbreaking gentleness. Listen to me. Lucien does not want territory. He does not want victory. He wants revenge. And specifically, he wants revenge against me. His voice was steady. So I give him what he wants. I trade my life for peace. The war ends. You and our son survive. I would rather die beside you than survive without you. That is not an option. Then make it one. Kael pressed his forehead against her stomach, his arms wrapping around her. I have spent my entire life fighting, and the one thing I have learned is that some battles cannot be won through violence. They can only be ended through sacrifice. He looked up at her. Let me save what is left before we destroy everything completely. Selene felt tears streaming down her face. This was not supposed to be how their story ended. They were supposed to win, take the throne, build something better. Instead, they were trapped inside a nightmare of their own creation, drowning in consequences neither had fully anticipated when they first decided love was worth betrayal. When do you leave? She whispered. Tomorrow? at dawn. And if he kills you immediately, then at least the killing stops. Kael stood and pulled her into his arms. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other while their son moved between them, the only innocent thing left in a situation built entirely from adult choices and catastrophic consequences. Finally, Selene spoke against his chest. "I need you to promise me something. Anything. If you do not come back, I will raise our son to know the truth. Not propaganda, not the sanitized version history will write. The real truth about what we did and why we did it and what it cost." Kael's arms tightened. Why? Because he deserves to understand that love is not always noble. Sometimes it is selfish. Sometimes it is destructive. Sometimes it burns kingdoms down and leaves nothing but ash. Her voice cracked. And he needs to know that his parents were not heroes. We were just two broken people who loved each other badly and paid the price. Kael pulled back enough to look at her. "You think he will hate us?" "I think he should." For a long moment they simply stared at each other, both understanding that this might be the last conversation they ever had. Then Kael kissed her, gently, desperately, like someone memorizing a sensation they would never experience again. When he pulled away, his eyes were wet. "I loved you the moment I saw you drowning inside that palace, and I will love you until whatever comes after death stops having meaning." Selene touched his face. "I know." He walked toward the door, but her voice stopped him one last time. "Kael." He turned. She smiled through tears. "It was worth it. All of it. Even the parts we regret." Kael's expression broke completely. Then he left, and Selene collapsed onto the floor, her hands pressed against her stomach, whispering apologies to a child who would grow up without a father because his parents had valued their own happiness above the survival of thousands. Kael rode toward the capital alone. No armor, no weapons, just a white flag and a single message carried by advance riders to ensure Lucien knew he was coming. The journey took 3 days. 3 days of moving through territory torn apart by war, past burned villages, past mass graves, past refugees fleeing violence they did not cause and did not understand. Every mile was a reminder of what his choices had created. When he finally reached the capital walls, Imperial guards escorted him through streets that looked exactly as he remembered. Golden domes, marble courtyards, royal banners. Except now everything was wrapped in the tension of a city living under siege mentality. They brought him directly to the throne room, the same room where he had killed guards and started this entire catastrophe. Bloodstains still darkened the marble floors despite obvious attempts to clean them. Lucien sat on his throne wearing black military dress and a crown that looked heavier than it had 18 months earlier. His face was thinner, harder. Aged by war in the same way Kael had been aged. Two men who had once been brothers, now separated by an ocean of blood. Guards lined the walls. Advisors stood nearby. But Lucien raised one hand and everyone fell silent. For a long moment, the two men simply stared at each other. Then the king spoke, his voice cold and controlled. "You came? You knew I would? Part of me hoped you were smart enough to stay away. I stopped being smart the moment I fell in love with your wife." Lucien smiled without warmth. "At least you are honest." He descended from the throne slowly and walked toward Kael, stopping a few feet away. "Why are you here, General?" "To surrender." The throne room erupted in shocked whispers. Lucien raised his hand again for silence. "Explain." Kael took a slow breath. "This war has cost the Empire everything. Tens of thousands dead, infrastructure destroyed, alliances shattered, trade routes collapsed. We have bled ourselves trying to settle a personal dispute that should never have involved anyone else." His voice was steady. "So I offer myself as payment. Execute me publicly. Make your example. But declare amnesty for everyone who followed me. End the war. Let the Empire heal. And what do I gain from this arrangement? What you wanted from the beginning. Revenge." Lucien studied him for a long moment. "You think your death is sufficient payment for what you took from me?" "No, but it is all I have left to offer." "What about her?" The question hung in the air like poison. Kael met his eyes directly. "Leave her out of this. She followed my lead. The guilt is mine. The guilt is shared. Then execute us both. But spare the territories that supported us." Lucien laughed bitterly. You think I want your blood? I have spent 18 months dreaming of nothing else, and now that you stand before me offering it freely, I realize it means nothing. He turned away. Killing you does not undo the betrayal. It does not restore what was broken. It does not make me feel anything except more empty than I already am. Then what do you want? Lucien was silent for a long time. Finally he spoke, his voice so quiet Kael almost missed it. I want to understand why. Why what? Why you chose her over everything else? Over duty, over friendship, over the empire we built together. He turned back and his expression was devastated. I have spent months trying to comprehend how my closest friend could betray me so completely. And the only answer I keep reaching is that I was never worth your loyalty to begin with. That is not true. Then tell me why. Kael took a slow breath, because she made me feel human. For the first time in my entire life, someone looked at me and saw more than a weapon, more than a soldier, more than the undefeated wolf. His voice cracked. She saw the man I never let anyone else see, the part of me that was scared and lonely and so tired of killing that I could barely stand my own reflection. And that was worth destroying everything? Yes. The admission echoed through the throne room. Lucien stared at him for a long moment. Then he began to laugh, not from humor, from the kind of broken recognition that came from finally understanding something terrible about yourself. You know the truly tragic part? I felt exactly the same way about her. She was the first person who ever made me feel like something other than a king. But instead of telling her that, I locked her in a cage and wondered why she stopped breathing. He walked back toward his throne. We are both idiots. You for sacrificing everything for love. Me for believing possession was the same thing. Lucien sat down heavily, suddenly looking exhausted beyond measure. Here is what is going to happen. I am ending this war. Not through your execution, through abdication. The throne room exploded. Your Majesty, you cannot be serious. This is madness. The Empire needs strong leadership. Lucien raised his hand, and the protest died. The Empire needs leadership that has not been corrupted by personal vendettas. I have spent 18 months burning my own kingdom to punish 2 people for finding what I never could. He looked at Kael. You want to save the Empire? Take the throne. Rule with her. Build something better than what I created. I do not want power. Neither did I initially. But we do not always get to choose our burdens. Lucien stood. You understand loyalty. You inspire it naturally. The soldiers love you. The common people know your name. You are everything I tried to be and failed. His voice was hollow. So prove me wrong. Prove that the Empire can survive leadership built on something other than fear. This is a trap. This is exhaustion. Lucien descended from the throne one final time. I will announce the abdication tomorrow. Cite health concerns. Recommend you as my successor. The noble houses will object initially, but they will fall in line once they understand the alternative is continued civil war. And what will you do? Lucien smiled sadly. Disappear. Find whatever peace exists for men who broke everything they touched. He extended his hand toward Kael. For a long moment, Kael simply stared at the offered gesture. Then he stepped forward and clasped Lucien's forearm in the old military grip they had used years earlier before betrayal in love and war had destroyed everything between them. When they released each other, both men looked older, more tired, more human. I am sorry, Kael said quietly. For all of it. Lucien nodded. So am I. Then the king, who had ruled through fear and possession, walked out of his own throne room, leaving behind a crown he had never truly wanted and a kingdom he had never truly understood. And Kael stood alone in the sudden silence, understanding that he had just been given exactly what he fought for, and now had to live with the weight of it. The coronation happened 2 weeks later. Not the grand celebration traditionally associated with royal succession, but a quiet ceremony attended by surviving nobles, military commanders, and common representatives who had lived through 18 months of hell. Kael stood before the throne wearing black instead of traditional royal colors. Selene stood beside him, having given birth 3 days earlier to a son they named Marcus, after the Lieutenant Lucien had executed for nothing except proximity to their affair. The baby slept peacefully in her arms while a priest conducted abbreviated rituals that felt more like funeral rites than celebration. When the crown was finally placed on Kael's head, it felt less like victory and more like penance. The empire he inherited was broken, tens of thousands dead. Infrastructure collapsed, trust shattered, and he understood immediately that the rest of his life would be spent trying to repair damage he had helped create. That night, alone in the royal chambers that had once belonged to Lucien and Selene, Kael stood near the window watching the capital below. Selene approached carrying their sleeping son, her movements still careful from recent childbirth. She stood beside him in silence for a long time before speaking. "Do you regret it?" Kael looked at her. At the woman he had destroyed an empire for. At the child who existed because two people chose personal happiness over collective stability. "Every day," he said quietly, "and not at all." "How is that possible?" "Because regret is not linear. I can acknowledge the destruction we caused while still believing you were worth fighting for." He touched her face gently. "We broke everything. But maybe we can build something better from the pieces. Or maybe we just broke everything," Selene said softly. "And the rest of our lives will be spent pretending reconstruction is the same as redemption." Kael pulled her close, careful not to disturb the baby sleeping between them. "Then we pretend together." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other while the empire they had torn apart slowly began the painful process of healing. Years passed. The reconstruction was brutal. Kael ruled with the restraint of someone who understood exactly how much damage unchecked power could cause. He rebuilt trade routes, reformed tax systems, established councils that gave common people actual voice instead of just the illusion of representation. Selene transformed the royal court from performance into something brutally honest. No more political marriages disguised as devotion. No more queens treated like decorative property. Together they created something imperfect but real. Their son Marcus grew up surrounded by truth instead of propaganda. They told him everything, about the affair, about the war, about the thousands who died because his parents valued their love above stability. Some nights he hated them for it. Other nights he understood. Most nights he simply tried to figure out how to be better than the people who raised him. Lucien was never seen again. Rumors placed him in distant monasteries, foreign kingdoms, isolated mountain villages, but no one knew for certain. And eventually, the empire stopped looking, because some ghosts were meant to haunt from a distance rather than be dragged back into the light. One evening, 10 years after the coronation, Selene found Kael standing in the same tower where their affair had truly begun. She climbed the stairs slowly, her body aged by time and childbirth and the weight of ruling. He turned when she entered and smiled. Not the exhausted smile of a man carrying impossible weight, just the quiet smile of someone who had found peace with their choices. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Kael gestured toward the capital below, golden in the setting sun. "Whether we were worth it. All this, everything we destroyed to reach this moment." Selene moved to stand beside him. "And what conclusion did you reach? That we were not worth it. But maybe our son will be." She leaned against him. "That is a heavy burden to place on a child. We placed heavier ones. At least this one comes with hope instead of just guilt." They stood in silence, watching their empire slowly transform into something neither Lucien nor the old noble houses would recognize. Not built on fear, not built on possession, but built on the hard-earned understanding that power without humanity was just another form of tyranny. "I loved you," Kael said quietly. "Past tense?" He looked at her. "Present tense. Future tense. Every tense that exists and some that do not." Selene smiled. "Even knowing everything it cost? Especially knowing everything it cost." He pulled her close, because that is what real love looks like. Not the clean version in stories, but the messy, complicated, destructive version that happens when two people collide inside circumstances neither can control. And empires? Empires survive through fear, but people survive through love. His voice was soft. "I know which one matters more now." Somewhere deep in the palace, rebuilt from ashes and blood and impossible choices, their son was studying history texts that told the truth about his parents instead of legends. Learning that heroes were rarely heroic, that villains were rarely purely evil, that most people existed in the complicated space between, making terrible choices for reasons that made sense at the time even if they destroyed everything. And maybe, just maybe, understanding that would help him build something better when his turn came. because that was the only redemption people like Kael and Selene would ever receive. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just the hope that the next generation would learn from their mistakes instead of repeating them. The sun set over Blackthorne capital, turning everything gold in shadow. And two people who had burned kingdoms for each other stood watching, understanding that their story was not beautiful. It was not noble. It was not even particularly good, but it was real. And sometimes, in a world built on performance and lies and carefully maintained illusions, real was the only thing worth fighting for, even when fighting meant destroying everything to find it.